All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association's webinar series. Today's educational webinar is on collecting and understanding tourism data with Daniel Nāho'opi'i. My name is Monica Poling, and I'm the Marketing and Public Relations Manager for IANTA. IANTA provides technical assistance and training to tribal nations and Native-owned enterprises engaged in tourism, hospitality, and recreation. IANTA's mission is to define, introduce, grow, and sustain American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian tourism that honors traditions and values. Since 2007, IANTA has been showcasing Indian country tourism on a global stage by establishing a presence at the world's leading travel trade shows, including Showcase USA Italy, ITB Germany, IPW, Brand USA Travel Week, NTA Travel Exchange, and World Travel Market in London. Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian tourism enterprises looking to attract more visitors to their destinations have the opportunity to join IANTA in building a presence in some of the most important tourism markets around the world. To learn more about global marketing, including targeting tour operators and the travel trade, join us for Go International, a 2-day training designed to guide tribal enterprises and businesses in conceptualizing and developing tourism product. This event will take place April 19th and 20th in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Visit our website at ianta.org to learn more about our education program offerings. As a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A or the chat, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Collecting and Understanding Tourism Data. I am pleased to introduce you to our speaker for today, Daniel Nāho'opi'i, Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian. Daniel is the Executive Vice President of SMS, a marketing research company based in Honolulu, Hawaii. With nearly 30 years' experience in marketing research and evaluation, Daniel previously served as the Director of Tourism Research and Planning for the Hawaii Tourism Authority, where he managed the production, organization, and interpretation of data related to Hawaii's visitor industry. He also led the statewide tourism strategic plan process and the evaluation of HTA's efforts. Born and raised in Honolulu, Daniel is a graduate of Kamehameha schools. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Industrial and Electrical Engineering from Northwestern University and an MBA from the University of Hawaii. He was also selected as one of the top 40 under 40 by Pacific Business News. He was named a Pacific Century Fellow, and he received a certificate from First Nations Futures Institute at Stanford University. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Daniel.
Aloha, Monica. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction there. And aloha kako to everybody out there across the United States and maybe even international, visiting for today, and here to hear a little bit more about tourism data and why is it so important for improving your tourism products, as well. More importantly, why is it important for Indigenous peoples working in the tourism industry? I'd like to start by just getting a sense of where we are. What is that first word that comes to mind when you hear tourism data? Please type that in the chat, and Monica's going to review those, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion later on that. But it could be a feeling, it could be some words that you associate it with, or what the buzzword that you're hearing from your staff and your colleagues. So please put a couple words in there. So we have. Oh, I see some interesting discussions. So a lot of it's money, 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 but it's also things about maybe not reliable, improvement, demographics. We'll continue there and keep putting them in, and we'll bring that up in our next section. So why is data important for indigenous tourism, however? We talk about some of the issues with tourism data itself. As a business, you collect data information and your marketing research. But why is it also, more importantly, it's the critical need to collect data as an indigenous tourism product or an indigenous person in the tourism industry. And I wanted to just start this off to change the framework and lens of how we see tourism as an indigenous person. First off, I have this little model here, and this is our mauna, our mountain. So I see tourism as 3 lenses, 3 customers, and 3 groups of stakeholders. That's really different than what you would say in the mainstream tourism, where where mainstream tourism industry focuses just first on the guest, the visitor. But as you notice, the visitor is on the side here, and our foundation is the land. And as indigenous people, land is our foundation, and we have to give it as much weight in research and understanding of impacts as we do the visitor. Similarly, there's the host, as you see on the right side, which is the community or the tribe. And they also need to be involved in the research. They need to be asked about their interaction with tourism. How is tourism benefiting the host, the community? How is it impacting or making change within their own community? So what we're trying to do is strive for a balance between all 3 sides so that the triangle doesn't tip over and our mountain is strong and tall, like our Mauna Kea. So when people talk about research, I'll just do the technical part here now. Typically, when you're talking about research, you first define a problem or objective, determine the research design, meaning how are you going to approach the research? What are the questions you're going to ask and design in that? And then 3 is design and prepare a research instrument. So are you going to do a survey? Are you going to do some interviews? What kind of questions, as I mentioned, are you going to be asking? 4 is looking at who are you going to be asking or where are you going to get this data from? Is it people within your community? Is it the visitors coming into your store? Or are you looking at a broader sample of potential visitors or potential customers across the nation or maybe international? And then how are you going to do that? How are you going to get to them and reach that sample of people? The 5th level that we always work with next is then you do the analysis. And I'll talk a little bit about analysis. We talk about segmentation. We talk about looking at competitive analyses, etc. And a lot of people, researchers, I should say, because I'm a researcher myself, we forget about the last one. But that's just as important, which is to visualize and communicate the results. It's great to find things and, you get the technical scientific understanding of what's happening. But the most important part is that information has to get out to your other stakeholders so that you can change and make data-driven decisions so they can make data-driven decisions. So that's the important part. So if you look at all 6 parts, we'll talk a little bit about each today in our session. So the first step, as we talked about, the need. And goals for your destination or for your tribe or your state. Typically, it's something like increased visitor arrivals. We need more visitors to come in. We've seen a slump in visitors right now with the various restrictions in COVID because of COVID and the apprehension to travel. How are you going to increase visitors? It might be a different market, etc. How about optimize visitor spending? And is that your goal? Do you need to have more money coming in, more revenue? You set that goal and then you work for the strategies around it. From that, if you have a goal of increasing spending, is it to have them spend more time in your destination, or is it bring in higher spending visitors, more affluent visitors that can spend more on the products that you're offering? It could be minimizing visitor impacts. You know, in some destinations, we talk about over tourism or over visiting a situation, but you don't have to limit the number of visitors sometimes, but minimize the visitor impact. So you can assess how things are changing. How can you move visitors around to get them to places that have less impact or can add benefit in another way? When you're looking at assessing need, maybe you just need to be top of mind. I mean, you need to be more competitive against your other say tours or other destinations, right? So we're trying to increase top of mind and awareness. Or monitoring performance. A lot of data is used for tracking when we talk about dashboards and monitoring to see how well you're doing along the way, so that you can make improvements, continuous improvement as you go along. So you can collect data that way for tourism. It's not just for marketing purposes. And then the final one is very important for a lot of us in indigenous tourism. A lot of our work is funded by grants or state money or tribal money. And so those stakeholders expect for you to justify why the funding was given. So you use, your need may be an evaluation need. You need to understand what the expected outcomes are in the mid to short term, and then how about the long-term impacts? Did your program actually change behavior or attitude in some way? So assessing need is important. It's the first step in creating a good tourism research program. So we're going to get everybody up and do a little bit. We're going to do a poll. So the poll is, what is your priority need for data? And you see Monica has put that in. Just collect one, check off one of these. I put a couple of different situations. If you do check other, you can maybe put in the chat what you think your other will be. And we'll see where everybody is today. Hey, Monica, how do you think everybody had a chance to answer the questions? Do we need more people to come? Increase revenue, as I mentioned. Improvements, that's the tracking and monitoring. And then, okay, let's see. Oh, it's, we see those two on the monitoring and program evaluation. We need to make improvements to program or product. And many of you also have, we need to justify our funding to stakeholders. Great. Okay, so I know a little bit more about where we're going to talk about today. And we need to have the right people. Thank you so much. Okay, let's move on. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and Monica will help me to bring those to the forefront and we can answer your questions. Okay, so going back to our mauna, our triangle that we talked about, I'm going to talk about destination first, and we'll leave talking about visitors to the end, since more people are familiar with the visitor section. So here are some questions and research you can do for the destination. So if you're working on the destination, the land, maybe you can ask about, does the visitor impact the natural resources? So let's think about, are visitor programs sustainable? Do they, does not deplete the resources? So that's something on the next point. So when we're developing the research, so we're going to look at how are they impacting the natural resources? How is the land benefiting from the visitor? Is another area of research. So do the funds flow back into the restorations I put here? So like, you know, revenue coming from a tour, Does the tour operator, if they're visiting a destination, do they contribute to the site? You know, and you can assess that by questions to the visitors. Are they willing to spend more when they go to the tour? Are they willing to set aside a little bit of their tour money to go back to benefiting the land? Does the destination have the resources and infrastructure necessary to support a quality visitor experience? Now, this is one that many of you in the destinations, or maybe you have a park, or you can rate the hardscape. You know, that's always important to track and monitor. You know, how well are the restrooms and the facilities? That's a very basic, but also, you know, are the trails being maintained? Can you find, is the information there so that you can find where the trail is and such? And that's always good to keep track and ask the visitor quite often along the way. And of course, this comes up quite often in our communities about the traffic and the impacts. So if you understand where the traffic is happening or the impacts are happening, then you can go back to your stakeholders and work with them to figure out ways of diverting more money or funding more money towards improvements, or it could be working with tour operators to set up certain times, certain drop-off points. That's all important, and that's all about tourism data and research. So here's the other side, the host and community culture. These are questions that we forget to think about when we're doing research, but it should be included when we're doing our research planning. You know, is the tourism product facilitating education of the visitor? As Indigenous people, stories are so important. So what story is being told and who is telling this story is important for your products. We've done studies where we've asked the visitors, you know, what do you think when you think of Native Hawaiian culture? And it typically comes up with the luau or surfing or something, but there's so much more. And then from that, we can work out informational campaigns, working to develop better product that carries out our more traditional stories and education. How is tourism product making the community stronger? You know, this is where the economic impact studies, you know, how many jobs are being created? Are the jobs being filled by the community? What level of jobs? These are all questions that you set up on your research program. Important one is, does the community feel comfortable with the visitors around? You know, there are ways that you need to ask the community as well as the visitors on both sides. Has the community been respected by the visitor? You know, are sacred spaces and knowledge treated appropriately? So asking the community, the tribes, and the people who work in those areas, you know, have there been issues? Are there conflicts in the way the promotions are being done? And who defines what is sacred or not? And that's important, I think. And you can tell that by asking a visitor, oh, where did they hear this? You know, what kind of information are they getting out? So now that I've talked about the two sides that we hardly ever discuss, let's go into the visitor, our traditional tourism data model. But I'll put a little more detail into that so that we can have more of an indigenous framing of it. So for those who typically don't work in tourism data collection or have a program or product that's cultural in nature, but you know, are not familiar with the tourism industry, tourism industry is very multi-layered and multifaceted. So I wanted to just give you a couple of, this is a list that you can use when you're developing your own research. And it's pretty much the typical and also the critical factors in tourism and the kind of information that you need when you need to develop better programs, develop better marketing materials. So typically we start with who is visiting. So that's kind of the characteristics of the visitor in terms of their age, the basic demographics, age, income, education. Very critical in tourism is also life stage and lifestyle. So life stage meaning, are they just starting a family, or are they have older children, so they have a lot of teens, or are they in your target market is maybe more seniors or something. That's very different because what they do and how they go about doing it is important in this decision-making for tourism and travel. Lifestyle is very different too. Are they active, doing a lot of adventure travel, doing a lot of activities, going to the gym or going outside a lot, versus are they more the lifestyle, maybe they are cultural. They do cultural activities inside museums and such. That's important too. Party size, as you know, people travel typically, there's singles, but a lot of them travel, a lot of travelers are in couples or maybe a family group. Multi-generational is important to understand, not just the nuclear family, but if it's multi-generational, you may see the person who's actually in charge of making all the choices is maybe a grandparent or such, and they're paying. So you need to reach them and not just the family that's traveling. And purpose of trip is very important, most of for leisure or vacation, but many travel across the nation because of business, and then they put in a little bit of leisure with that. Okay. We have our zip codes, right? Zip coding is very good because there's a lot of other data applications and data sources that are organized by zip code. So you can get additional information if you always capture the zip code. The other thing to look at, how much did they spend? And it's not just per trip, like how much did you spend across your whole trip, but also per day, because you need to know some visitors spend all of their money towards the end of the day, towards the end of their trip, and some spend it way up front. So you need to look at both per trip and per day. A lot of times things are listed per day, but maybe you have somebody who's staying a very long time, but their overall spending is not that much, but because they're spending so long, I mean, their daily spending is not that much, but if they stay for 10 days, 15 days, they make quite an impact in your destination because of the length of their stay. We talked about the active travelers and the plop and drop, those who maybe just come to the poolside or do a vacation rental or something. So you need to understand that characteristics of a visitor. Another question you might want to ask is first time or repeat. That's very critical because maybe in a first time visitor, they're trying things out. So they'll go to many activities, many destinations within their trip. But in a repeat, they'll come back and focus more intently on one topic or one area. And then after a while, it becomes how frequent, because are your products reaching frequent travelers or repeat travelers? A lot of destinations develop the iconic first time trip type of products, but then have not really worked well on developing repeat visitors. Things that are good for repeat visitors to keep them coming back, to keep them spending is an important part to look at in research. And another thing to ask yourself in your research is how long did they stay? As I talked about the trip cycle, right? Some people spend a lot at the beginning and then they taper out. Lodging is important because the bulk of their spending typically is spent on the lodging component. And if they're staying a long time, most of their purse is going to be on the lodging. So you only have a smaller bit of that budget to work on your own destination or your product. So many of you who are familiar with marketing talk about segments in the population. Different people act differently, but there's very groups of people, right? That we can put people into groups that act similarly, and it's important to find these within, because if you don't, in your analysis, you might say, "Oh, okay, it looks like everybody spends 10 days at your destination or something." But then that's the average, 10 days. But then when you look at it, there's actually two groups. You have some that stay only 5 days and some that are staying 15 days, but that averages out to 10 or something like that. So it's important to look at the segments within the population and who they are. So these are the typical segments that I would look at in doing our research. First is the geographic differences. So you have major markets and developing markets for your destination. What I mean is a major market would be somebody, typically this relates to international travel and such. Major market means they come to your destination. It's very easy for them to come. They're familiar with traveling. And in their market, they have a well-developed network between you and their market, so it's easy to buy a product, easy to get a trip or travel. The communication network is good, so they know a lot about your market, know about your destination or your product. In the developing market, I mean, your destination or your product within the destination is new to them. So for example, you have some travelers from China or something that haven't been to that area where your product is or where your company is working on. And so there's not that many tour operators or travel agents that are familiar with the product. It makes a big difference. So you have to kind of look at that. The other is the life stages that we talked about. Are they just getting married? Like a wedding or a honeymoon, they'll be spending lots of money doing all the activities because they're just trying to, they're trying to impress themselves, do a lot. It might be their one-time or dream destination trip, as opposed to a family where they're going to do different activities for the children, and it has to be a larger, so they have to find a lodging that's large enough to accommodate the family. And then you have the different age stages as well. And lifestyle, we talked about already, the adventure, culture, like the museum and cultural participation. Another is the lifestyle is just snowbirds, which means, they're coming for the winter to your destination, hanging out. They may have their own place if they're a second home owner, and that's very different. You have generational differences that many talk about, the way baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. The newest one right now is Gen Z. Typically those in their 20s right now who have a very different approach to the millennials. And then we also talk about ethnic and heritage and other classifications. There's information on all of these, and why segments are so important is that in the tourism industry, everything is about distribution and marketing. So just think about it this way. It's think about magazines and nowadays online websites, blogs. They're all set up across these segments. So if you need to communicate to someone, you don't just do a general travel guide or a general travel magazine. Typically, you will have better effect if you better impact if you can approach these more segmented, specialized channels. There's travel agents that just specialize in one area. There's travel agents that just specialize in LGBT travel or ethnic travel. And so you need to expand your reach by focusing on these segments within your customers. Okay, so let's do another poll, just so we can get a sense of where everyone is. I put down a list of targets, or your primary targets or primary segments that you may be looking at, because you want to focus when you're doing your planning and also your research. So let's see how you do your marketing, and then would, of course, follow in your research. We have, as I mentioned, adventure travelers, those who do a lot of activities, going out. There's also those who are visitors who are interested in culture activities and are gaining more knowledge, the education type of visitors. International visitors, how many of you actually focus just on international visitors, or that's one of your primary targets? Or maybe you have a product or an area that's just for families. Typically, you're looking for the family travelers. Larger, which is great, they spend more as a whole. What did we see? Oh, okay. So our poll shows visitors who are interested in cultural activities and knowledge. Great. And adventure travelers, another sign, and some international visitors. But you notice there's 22% of you don't really focus on any one segment, but do a broad range, which is okay for your product and your area and your destination. But think about it. Have you gone back and investigated within your general customers? Are there underlying tones of these market segments that maybe if you need to expand business, then you can focus on those underlying segments in your customer base? Okay, so the next step in research is developing the questions for the visitors. So we already talked about, the demographics, and you have the list. And I made this presentation so you can go back and refer to it with those list of questions and factors, so that you can help develop your research. So we have the demographics, right? We talked about age, marital status, right? Family or not. Also where they're from, right? We talked about trip characteristics. Are they here for a leisure vacation? Are they here for, is it a trip that includes business and leisure? Is it a long haul trip or a short? Are they just here for a couple of days? Or maybe they're just a day tripper. Visitor attitudes and needs. That goes to the likes and dislikes, so we can help to fine tune your products and your destinations. Expectations. It's always important, you have higher satisfaction is gained through the trip meeting the expectations of the visitor, right? So if they come in looking for a certain product and they expected a certain level of service and product, if it's met or even exceeded, then your satisfaction goes up. And then higher satisfaction leads to higher rate of return or promotion. So someone who's satisfied, of course, will then tell their friends and family, and they will come back again. So you have the 3 steps that you need to build up. So, that's where we go to what would get me to come back or change my mind on what you need to do. Remember, research is all about finding data to change attitudes and behavior when you're talking about visitors. Visitor behavior, here we go to the planning stages. That's a lot of research. Tourism data is used in identifying how they found out about your product or your destination and what made them choose your product and destination or destination. And then also, what do they typically do at home? Because that behavior that they do at home carries through into what they do, in your destination. And so we tend to forget to ask about what they're doing at home. We tend to say, oh, what are you doing here in your, on your trip? But you also have to ask about, in general, do you typically go out and do other activities, or mainly, you are not as active? So if they're not active at home, then I don't expect them to do too much when they're on their trip as well, right? Or if they go to certain types of cultural activities, then you would think when they come to your destination, they're looking for those similar types of activities, but customized to your destination. So you have to make sure that product is there. So now that we kind of talked about the questions to ask, let's talk about the kinds of research that can be done so that we can gather the data that we're looking for. So here today, you talk about market research. So market research is looking at what's happening in the tourism industry right now. What are the travel trends? There's a lot of information. I'll show you a list of places to go, websites to visit, or sources of data that you can look at travel trends. Is it short term? Is the trend right now short visits within domestically, just within the United States because of all the restrictions? Are people looking for more cultural or informative types of activities now, as opposed to just doing leisure or just sitting out at the beach or something? So you want to monitor those travel trends. And those are unique in purchase reports. I like, how Sherry puts out the Rupert report. It gives a lot of the information about travel trends, and she aggregates it from different parts of our industry. What's new? So in terms of product, if you're doing product and market research, what's new in your space? What are your competitors doing? What do you see? We're trying to establish, a baseline of what we're doing before we collect our own data. Look at what you're doing. Are you meeting your customers' needs? Are they asking, in the comments, are they asking for something? Oh, do you have this? I wish you had that. And how are they learning about your product when we're talking about the marketing side of it and the channels and distribution? How are they finding out about your product or your destination? And then we go on to the competitive research. You might want to do a study just on how others are doing. And you might ask the people who come into your store or to your destination, well, where else did you think of traveling to? Or what did you do last year? What destination you went to? Or what product did you buy last time that's similar to ours or something like that? Or what other stores did you walk by, but you came into ours? That's a great way of setting up. You have to know what's happening in your competitive set. And then keeping track of that. So create your own competitive set and monitor what they're doing as well. And important, many of you mentioned about justifying your funding to your stakeholders. So it's important to set it up in this sense, tracking the cost per something. So cost per visitor or cost per visitor who saw your ad and came in to your store or came to your product. That's important for that. Conversion would be how many saw whatever marketing or advertising that you did or heard about it and actually came in. You set up your metrics that way. And then also process improvements. We forget to measure along the way. You can't do this causal effect that at the very end that it takes a year or 2 years to change behavior. But what you need to know is small incremental amounts of, well, did some people think about it differently? You can ask about, did they think about it differently? And then maybe after a while, you can ask, did they actually change what they were doing? Okay, so you need to make small process improvements. Important thing to consider when designing research and making choices. You're gonna you might not do the research yourself, but you need to develop your budget and ask for a vendor to do it. It's important to look at two things. One is the value of the item versus the cost of obtaining information. There is a lot of studies out there, syndicated studies, and you could join. That might be cheaper. If you just need some data, and you can find a research service or a research company that's doing maybe what we call a syndicated study, where you just have to add in a few more questions. Or maybe you can join in with a group of similar products or destinations together, right? And to get that information, maybe you just customize versus standardization. So do you need a custom study? Very specific. Everybody wants to do a custom study, but maybe if you go back to your needs and your objectives, you just need to track what's happening in the industry or just in your area. So maybe you can work with broader results. So maybe you can buy a syndicated study, or you can subscribe to maybe some kind of a subscription service that's monitoring your area, or you can work with your state or county office that has more broader information, but it gives you a trend of where everything is going, what the impact is, the economic number of jobs, etc. And you don't have to do a customized. So you have to think about that. The other thing is consistency of data. So just don't do a study one time. It never pays off because you need to compare it to what happened before and what's going to happen going forward. Always think about it of setting up your information and data over a course of a period of time. And you can collect parts of it if you don't have the funds to do it all. But at the same time is what was collected before. You know, as I mentioned, we have to do some research ahead of time, you know, collect some information. So you know what kind of data you have, and then what can be continuously tracked and monitored. A lot of times you may have vendors say, oh, we can do this project for you, but then you realize that, you know, the data is only available one time, or, you know, the way the information is done, it's just one time. But next year, it won't be available because of the way data is being collected or the way a project is being funded, etc. So think about it in a longer term, over a couple of years, and then you can compare changes. A lot of times, like I mentioned, to change attitude and behavior, it takes a while. So you have to monitor small changes in what's happening. So always plan accordingly, and don't expect 1 point in time is a trend. You know, I mean, 2 points is a trend. That doesn't work. So we already talked about the parts defining the problem. I'm just going to review a little bit more here. So if you want to define, there's survey research, you know, asking the individuals about the attitudes, preference, buying behavior. That's a type of research you can do. You can do observational research. You know, you don't have to ask them directly, but you can just see what people are doing in your store. You can have somebody observing what's happening. You can have monitors out there if you're a destination, observing what's hawaiian. You know, for us, particularly as Indigenous people, the seeing and the showing is so important. You know, in Hawaiian, we have a word called ike. It means knowing, so to know. It also means to show or seeing, and it also means knowledge. So you have 3 facets. So observation is actually quite an important part of research. It doesn't always have to be a study with paper and pencil and asking directly. A lot of times it's just observing what's happening. Experimental research, you know, you hear this often, and it's very important to test. After you kind of have done some of your studies, you might want to test to see, comparing the 2 groups. You know, if one group did it one way, is it done again in another? Can it be replicated? Meaning, okay, then you can justify what had happened. And can you draw the line from this is what was done to this is what the impact was, and not just jump across? That's the causal relationship for a good evaluation if you have a program. So, you know, we talked about some of these points already. Developing the research plan, right? We determine some of the specific information needs. You gather the secondary information we talked about, a lot of sources out there already. And then you plan your primary data collection. So I'll just talk about a couple of things that you can look at that. So we already talked about the determining what you need, but there's a lot of data you already have. You don't always have to do some complicated survey and such. You know, you may already have, when people check in, if you're a store or a attraction, you may be already collecting people's names and addresses, right? You can add to that list and ask them a couple of questions when they're registering or they're signing in at the, similarly at your point of sales. As I mentioned, the one at the bottom there. There's government reports. You know, if you are a large destination or a state, there may be already data that's being collected from those agencies that can be added to what you're having, what you need to collect to adjust. Airline reports, if you have a lot of air travel, a lot of your visitors are travel by air, you can work with the airports or maybe harbors if you have, you know, and other transportation systems to track how many people are coming, and then you can compare to what you're seeing. It gives you good trending information and making sure that you stay at the same level as the rest of the area or your competitive set. We talked about guest comments. Analyzing guest comments in a systematic way is critical, and it's also free to some extent. Don't just jump on every single comment, but try to look at trends in what's happening. That's an important part of data research. And then, as I mentioned, look at the segments. You have to understand who's saying those comments. What kind of person are they? Hopefully, your data is tied to some background characteristics or demographics of the people leaving the comments. So remember to ask that in your comments, because as I mentioned, a lot of the demographics and lifestyle life stages determines or some of the factors of what they're expecting. And so the guest comments are saying they're not expecting this or that, and maybe because their life stage or style wants something different than what you're giving as a general. Okay, we talked about point of sales. You can always add on to at your point of sales and purchase. So you have the spending, but you need to have the characteristics, where they're from as well. So if you can put both of them together, then you have a very strong source of data. And then following up, once you have the names and the addresses and the emails, you can look at them on your social media and encourage them to continue to keep in contact with you. So I have a list here of some sources of data, information. These are linked, so when you have you can download the presentation later and get to these, or you can Google them. So all great general travel sources. Many of them keep up to date with weekly reports, or as their syndicated data gets updated, they'll make some of it free. So it's good to have as a source. Some of these, like STR, is the hotel data. You have US travel for, they have a dashboard travel industry forecast that comes out quite often. The National Travel Office has the American Indian Community Study, but they also do an overseas for international visitors and what are the trends in which countries are increasing or decreasing, etc. As well as you can go to the IANTA website, and they have a link to many of these sources and have their own studies as well. So we're getting close to the end, so I'll just go through these quickly so we can leave some time for questions. But these are types of studies you can do. You can do intercepts. You're very familiar with people going to Disney and asking you a question or two when they walk up to you. As I remember, always add the zip code so you can look at trends and where they're coming from, experiences. There's mail, telephone, web surveys. There's just a difference. They could be also put together. You can do some mail with a follow-up by a web, or etc., depending how cost-effective it is. And there's qualitative. Always put in qualitative information. And as Indigenous people, we like the qualitative, right? We need to have some justification by hearing what other people are saying. So, there's focus groups, which is more of a structured method. But you can also do in-depth interviews. You can ask people to, would you like to stay and give me some more information? Or when you assess those comment cards, that'll give you more in-depth interview, and you might want to follow up with them with some additional questions. Delphi is a way of actually talking to the subject matter experts. So you may be talking to some tour operators or agents and what they're hearing about what visitors are saying or what their potential visitors are saying. And then, of course, you can actually look at your comments and what people are posting on your TripAdvisor and actually analyze them and seeing what the trends are. We forget to look at these sources, public sources of information, as well as sentiment. There's a lot of apps out there that you can look at positive or negative comments and get a score and try to improve that. And the last thing I want to put out here is be careful, and this is where you need to pull in the expert or ask, someone at IANTA to help you, or, we have the Travel and Tourism Research Association, or, work with the university or your DMO. Sample is not representative of the population. So a lot of times when you try to do your own, when you do casual research, you may only be looking at a a certain group of people, or it's convenient. So you just ask the people around, but that's not really true. You have to remember, what was your original target that you're looking at? And you have to make sure you ask everybody within that target, a good cross section of those people within your target, and not just what's easy to find. Don't make too many assumptions, right? Always confirm your assumptions. It's okay to start with an assumption, a hypothesis, but confirm that what you heard. It's not just hearsay. Add the qualitative. I would enforce, a lot of vendors may say they want the quantitative, maybe a university is going to look at the numbers, but add the qualitative factors in there so you can get a rich, in-depth feeling of the data. And I think it's easier to communicate better to your stakeholders if you have qualitative components to it. What are people saying? How are they expressing their happiness or dissatisfaction? We talked about the segments. There could be underlying issues underneath of the general summation. Don't always look at averages. You have to kind of split things apart. And if you can see some trends underlying, that's important. The sophisticated statistical analyses, that's kind of, it's easy to just twist numbers around to support. So, just be cautious about that and ask a friend or ask an expert. And of course, always testing your questions. If you're ready to do your research, go out and test it on a few people and see if it comes back what you kind of expected it should. And if it seems a little odd, then something's biased. You're leading the question. Or so make sure you look at that and do a lot of pre-testing. Okay. So I'm gonna ask Monica if she saw anything in the chat, and we can bring this up. Hopefully, I've gone through a whole bunch of different items. It's very general statements, but it's to get you started in the discussion.
Daniel, I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but while we're waiting, can you talk a little bit more about the study that they did in Hawaii about what do you know about Hawaiian culture, and then what results came from that study or that survey?
Oh, okay. So we did one quite a while ago. Not 10 years, well, no, we need to redo it. It's a couple years ago, but it was a way to look at, we asked that, it's based on something that the Maori in New Zealand also did. Was asking, we had a list of, in our surveys for product development and our visitor satisfaction study, we asked them, when you think of Hawaiian culture, what do you think of? And there's some word associations. And we thought, have you done any cultural activities? And, it kept coming up that, we only did a few cultural activities. We only did, went to the luau, or we did some surfing. But when we looked at the whole list of activities that they had done, the visitors had actually done things like, listen to Hawaiian music, or went to the Bishop Museum, or participated in lei making, or participated in some storytelling. And it wasn't being associated with Hawaiian culture. So we went back and worked with some of the products to, one, infuse more Hawaiian culture in the, but also associate some of the things for those who were just doing it as a product or an attraction. And we said, acknowledge it as these are traditionally Hawaiian. Like surfing is a traditional Hawaiian sport. It's not just something from California. So by doing that, it brought up the level of awareness and a level of pride, I think, within the Native Hawaiians that are working in that industry, and it actually elevated visitors to want to know more about Native Hawaiian culture.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And Malia, just from the Native Hawaiian Hospitality Association, just confirmed the same thing. Sometimes the visitor doesn't realize that they're experiencing culture and what kind of activities they are doing. Great.
I see one from Ron Erdman that I forgot to put on that list, the state and tourism offices. So yes, working with your DMOs, and your state offices, they do studies they are already tracking visitors as a whole, and you can work in concert with them to see if maybe your attraction, or you could enhance. If you are a destination within that overall region, you can work with them and have data to track overall competitiveness, to fine tune some of the, provide a baseline for you, and then you can do a customized just to acknowledge your own customers within the subset of the visitors to the state. Yes.
And we had a question from Reginald Tiller. Will there be a link to this presentation available? Yes, after it's going to take about probably a day to get the video downloaded, but we will post that, and you can find that at ianta.org/webinar series, and all of our webinars on demand are in there. And Malia had another comment: cultural resources in your visitor industry are key to ensuring that whatever activity attraction you are doing can be enhanced by adding elements of your culture into it, whether it be the values of your culture or stories of your culture to be included in the activity.
Yes, definitely. I see one question. What is the best way to show local impact to the surrounding community? Local impact. I'm not sure if I got that question correctly. Maybe you could restate that. So I think maybe it's like within if I'm understanding this correctly, maybe you may have a destination or a tribe location, and then how that can benefit the community. Oh, here, economic impact in regards to supporting industry. Oh, okay. So typically economic impact has a couple of components. One is typically it's based on the spending, right? How much did the more money come into because of what you're doing, or more jobs being created, or more taxes being collected because of what you're doing? So if you can work with your state or county officials to actually work on an economic impact model for them or assessment, as long as you're collecting the information about how much are they spending or increase in spending. If you're increasing interest in an area and they start to spend more in your area because of that, or you brought them to this area, then you're incrementally adding to the economy, and that's economic impact. I always want to recommend that there is a community impact. So you may have increased knowledge of a surrounding community, so that's a positive benefit, and that can be added into your economic impact. Typically nowadays, we are trying to show not just the numeric the dollar value, but also increases in other areas. Have we made improvements of bringing in increased knowledge of your community in your area? Have you increased the kinds of services that are coming into your area that you would not otherwise have because of your tourism product? You can add that as well. Yes, I think so.
Are just about out of time. I would like to mention that Daniel also, there's an interview with Daniel in IANTA's Cultural Heritage Tourism Planner, which you can download for free at this link. And within the planner, it's the final chapter. There's also a long list of resources, including some of the ones that Daniel just mentioned, as well as others. Daniel, if you could advance the slide to your email address.
Oh, yes.
Also, always welcome to email Daniel for more information, or myself at IANTA as well. And we will have some of these links online as well in a day or so. So thank you all very much for attending. And thank you, Daniel.
Oh, Monica, so I also have a gift for everybody.
Oh, nice.
So if you want to have more information, more training, I recommend, if you're in the DC area or you want to actually make a commitment to attending our Marketing Outlook Forum. This is from the Travel and Tourism Research Association International. It includes speakers on the newest trends. We talked about travel trends, as well as forecasts for the upcoming year in various sectors of our market. There, a new thing this year is there will be a masterclass on doing dashboards and talking about how dashboards can be used to create action and communicating with your stakeholders. I was able to get a savings so that all IAMTA members can register at the actual TTRA member rate using the code here, 2022 MOF member rate. So you save $200 off of that, and it'll be in February in Bethesda. So please come attend that and take a look at how you can gain more information with research, tourism research, and not to be afraid of tourism data and research.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you, everyone. And if we will be sending out an email about the Marketing Outlook Forum discounted rate in the next day or so, so you'll have that information as well. Thank you all for attending.
Aloha.
Aloha.